We are going to finish Beloved this week. I hope you're enjoying it. I enjoyed reading the discussion board. I thought it was interesting to see your thoughts, hear your questions, see how you interacted with each other. It felt a little less at a distance. So we're going to do that again this week. And I've put a discussion up for this. I put actually two. One is just like we did last week. It'll be due Friday. And then I put another one just asking for some reflections after you finish the novel. It'll be due Sunday the 12th. I also want to remind you that you have a critical response essay that will be due on the 17th. That is not this Friday, it's the following Friday. That is just like the first critical response essay. You can choose any text. It needs to be a different text than you wrote about last time, but you can choose any text from the whole semester. If you choose to write about Beloved, then you may want to just choose a section. It's up to you how you do that, but you don't have to. If you choose to just look at one part of Beloved, that's fine. You don't have to cover the whole novel. So this video is going to have spoilers. So if you want to read before you watch this so that you know what happens and discover it as you read, then stop this, come back to it after you've read. Every time I teach Beloved, and I teach it every semester, I wish I could read it again for the first time. I wish I could have the experience of the parts sort of falling into place that hopefully you had as you read these most recent chapters. So chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18 are the chapters where we find out what happened to the baby girl that becomes Beloved. And each one of those chapters contributes a part of the story, and each one is from a different perspective. So chapter 15 is from baby Suggs' perspective as she thinks about that day. And then chapter 16 is from the perspective of the white men who came to recapture Setha and her children. Chapter 17 is Stampede, his perspective, and chapter 18 is Setha's perspective. So we see different parts of the day from each one of these characters, and we see different aspects of what happened on that day. So in chapter 15, we have some backstory about baby Suggs, and we also have her celebration, thinking about celebrating the fact that Setha and her grandchildren have made it to her home. And it begins, he said, it occurred to her to whoop, to celebrate. Maybe she could rejoice in this restoration of her family. What we learn about baby Suggs is that she had been on several plantations before she came to Sweet Home. She had had 8 children from 7 different fathers because, in her words, she had been on plantations where the masters studded their male slaves with their female slaves for reproduction to increase their property. And so she had not been able to keep any of those children except Hallie. And when Mr. Garner bought her, he bought Hallie as well and let her keep him. And all he wanted was to buy her out, to see her have a free life. And she said, between the two hard things, staying a slave or being bought out and leaving Hallie, she chose the hard thing that would make him happy. So she allowed Hallie to buy her out because she knew it would make him happy. We also find out that baby Suggs had been married. She had a husband. And that's where she gets her name. In slave narratives, traditionally naming is really important. Creating one's own identity through the act of naming oneself. So while Mr. Garner calls her Jenny Whitlow, and that's what her bill of sale said, Whitlow was the name of her master, and Jenny was the name that her given name. she calls herself Baby Suggs. Suggs for her husband. That was her husband's name. And Baby, because that's what he called her. And so she has her own name. And in that name, there's this identity. And this chapter is really about her coming to gain her own identity. She says, we're told that as Mr. Garner's driving her into Cincinnati, into her freedom, she looks down and she says, these are my hands. And she feels her heartbeat and she said, that's my heart. For the first time in her life, she owns her hands and she owns her heart. And we see that as the roots of that sermon that she gives in the clearing, where she says, love your flesh, love your heart, love your hands. Those they would rather tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. You gotta love them. And the roots of that sermon are this moment when she is on the back of the cart being driven to Cincinnati by Mr. Garner, and she realizes that she owns herself. And she didn't know how it would feel. How could Hallie have ever known how this would feel? But he did. And she feels it for the first time. And a lot of what she's thinking in that chapter is about how she didn't know anything about herself. Could she sing? Would she have been a good mother? Was she pretty? Who was she? Because in slavery, she was whatever the master defined her to be. That goes back to that idea of the rooster named Mister. As long as you cook and eat him, even if you cooked him and ate him, you would still be eating a rooster. But Paul D said, I was not allowed to be and stay what I was. He was not allowed to be and stay a man. And Baby Suggs was never allowed to be who she was. And in this moment, she discovers that she can be for the first time. And she talks about Sweet Home. And our view of Sweet Home has been that it was not that harsh. It was not the harshest version of slavery, physically. Compare Sweet Home to Alfred, Georgia. But the point here is that the cruelty of slavery was not the physical harm that it did to the slave. It was the emotional harm and the psychological harm. She says in this chapter, it was better here, about Sweet Home, it was better here, but I'm not. The sadness was at the center, the desolated center, where the self that was no self made its home, which is a really powerful sentence. The self that was no self, the self that had no identity, the desolated center. And by desolated center, she means center. She means all of those things she didn't know about herself. So a kinder version of slavery was still a cruel version of slavery. And we see that when she arrives at the Bodwin's house, this exchange between the Bodwins and Mr. Garner. And Mr. Bodwin says, we don't hold with slavery, even Garner's kind. And Garner says, look, Jenny, did you ever go hungry? Were you ever cold? Did you ever do without? And she's like, no, I had all those things, but you got my boy and I'm all broke down. And so even what Garner considers to be a more humane version of slavery is still a really cruel life. So anyway, we have that kind of construction of her backstory. We also have in this chapter the party. Stamp Paid started it. He went and collected blackberries that he said tasted like church. And they decided to make some pies to celebrate. And then some chickens. And before long, it turns into a party for 90 people. And everybody is there celebrating. But the next day, when Stamp Paid comes to chop more wood, to refill, to restock the firewood, the community has abandoned Baby Suggs. And she feels a dark and coming thing, but nobody from the community comes to them and says, wait a minute, some white men have ridden into town with the look. They've just abandoned her. And it's hard to exactly know why that is. That may be something that y'all want to think about in the discussion questions. But one of the things that Morrison tells us is the people begin to compare suffering. They think baby Suggs hasn't suffered the way that they have because she was bought out of slavery and driven across the Ohio River, when some of them had to escape and were still fugitives and could be restored, could be recaptured. They start to compare their suffering, and they think baby Suggs hasn't suffered the way that they have. What they don't know is baby Suggs' backstory, her 8 children, that she can't even remember what they looked like. All she remembers of one of them is that she loved the burned bottom of bread. So this deep hole in her mother's heart. And so that may be what it was, that they thought she was being too prideful in her celebration. What made her worthy of being the matriarch of the community, of preaching the sermons in the clearing, of telling them how to love themselves? How did they think that she doesn't know suffering? And of course, we know that she knows suffering, but they think she's being prideful. And so when the white men ride into town, nobody runs to baby Suggs' house to warn her. The next chapter begins with the 4 horsemen, when the 4 horsemen arrived. Or I think rode in, but anyway. And that is apocalyptic, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Morrison uses that phrase very carefully to kind of make us think of this as the apocalyptic moment. So when the 4 horsemen rode into town, we have 4 horsemen are the sheriff, school teacher, one of the nephews, and a slave catcher the school teacher has hired. And we find out what happened in this chapter. It's interesting that the divulging of this story that has just sort of been out there, we know something happened, but we don't know what, that Morrison gives this to the white men. And it's a lot of reasons for that, but that we'll talk about. But I want to, I want to draw your attention to a document in under modules in Canvas called A Tale of Horror. And that is a newspaper article that was published in an Ohio paper about a woman named Margaret Garner who killed her children to prevent them from returning to slavery. So this is based on a true story. And so you can see the newspaper article resembles the newspaper article that Stamp Paid was showing Pulte in chapter 17. And Morrison has called this the desperate strategy of infanticide. This desperation that parents may have felt to find any way to spare their children from the horrors of slavery. In the Holocaust, there were stories of women who had infants and were of Jewish women who were in concentration camps, and they would kill their infants rather than letting the Nazis kill their infants, because they knew that that was the fate that awaited their child, and they felt that it was more humane for them to kill them than it was for to let the Nazis do it, to allow their children to suffer and starve and freeze, only to be killed after that. And that